I'm Al Scuderi. I have the privilege of working with Phil for a number of years, and of course, being a friend of his for many years after we worked professionally together. You know, I thought it'd be a good idea if we kind of went around the room and everybody said who we are. I know the family all knows who they are, but those of us not on the family maybe don't. You'd like to know who we are. So let me start with our host up here today.
Hi, I'm Judy Hoyer. I was a prosecutor and worked with your dad in the late 70s and early 80s. I was 5 at the time.
Mainly childhood.
I'm Jane Wenzel, Phil's youngest. That's my son Connor.
And who's got her wig back there?
I'm Megan. I
Oh, that's
am.
fine.
I belong to him.
No, you don't. I got rid of you a few years ago. I'm Phil McNiff, obviously his son. My youngest, Megan Nelson. My eldest, Amanda Casarino. And my son is somewhere.
Over there with his wife.
Phil McNiff and his wife, Krista McNiff. That's my entire family.
And David.
Oh, I'm sorry, David.
That's David's husband.
It's my husband.
The camera crew, this is David Casarino, I'm sorry. He's done doing the honor of doing it for me.
I'm Emily Darstein, the 4th out of 5. This is my husband. Every other child in here is mine. or a spouse, or the one who was born on the day of Dad's funeral. And that's Baby Jackson, who was a week old.
Is it my turn?
Yeah.
I'm Joanne Cusack, and my husband Jim is over there. And we parked the car so we wouldn't be towed.
That's a good thing.
He belongs to you, right?
Yes.
Wait for the year.
I love Bill and Iris McNiff, and we've been friends for many years, and I love everybody in their family, and I'm glad to be here to be a part of this. Thank you.
Thank you.
From the very beginning of Tampa.
Go around the back if we didn't get everybody there.
We were all counted.
Yeah, we're
They're mine. They're mine. That's Daniel, that's Sarah, that's Mike,
And Jackson.
and Jackson, and that's Stephen, and that's Katie, and Bridget. Did I get everybody?
Wow.
And Andrew.
And Andrew.
Andrew.
Sorry, I have 6 kids.
Emily, you got quite a brood.
Yes, I do. And I also started at age 30.
I'm Laura Daniels, I'm Phil's third child, and this is my husband Ted.
Greg Hendrickson, former FBI agent, retired FBI agent. Phil was my first supervisor I had in the bureau when I came to Tampa first office. And then I didn't see him again, except maybe in New York when he was the administrative ASAC in the elevator or something like that. And then I wound up being the case agent on the Spirit case, which I think will be discussed earlier.
I'm Ron Jordan. I'm probably the guy that's known Phil the longest, other than maybe some of his children. He was my new agents counselor, and I'm going to speak about that later in 1966. So, and I have a photograph here for everybody too, that time period when he was there, that I was graciously made copies of and give to you. But I had a trifecta. He was also the ASAC when I came here. And do the kids, do they understand the ASAC and SAC?
I think so.
Yeah, they all know what that
Respect to Joe Santana was the SAC here.
Yes, and
Assistant.
Joe
He
Santana
was
was
the
the
assistant.
SAC at that time.
ASAC is the assistant.
And then I was lucky enough again that he came back as the SAC, so I've known him for 3 different periods, probably longer than anybody else. This one's good.
I'm Jim Cusack, I'm an ex-agent, and I was a neighbor of Phil's in Carrollwood, and we hung around together 45 years ago when he was the ASAC here, and we've been friends ever since.
I'm Greg Keogh, I'm a former prosecutor, practicing law here in Tampa now. Phil and I became very close working with the Spirit case with Greg and Al and Marty, and we just stayed great friends since then. He's been beating me up on the basketball court.
You boot everybody up, yes.
Yes.
Yeah, I should mention, Greg mentioned Marty Boland. He wanted to be here very much today, but he's having a health problem, so he apologizes and sends his best to everybody. You know, just wanted to say that, you know, there are a lot of adjectives. I sat around when I was being interviewed for television, and so many came flooding in. I mean, this guy was loyal, he was faithful, he was intelligent, he was just a person you admire. But looking at this aggregation here today, I have to add another one, and that is prolific. And really, it's kind of a cool word, because when I thought about that before, when I saw everybody coming through the door, I just did a little check. And it goes back to the Latin, and it means provider of life. Prolific is where it comes from. And just about, or the vast majority of the people in this room really had their life provided at some point, I guess, by Phil and Iris. So it's an amazing thing to see this many people together owing their existence to a certain person or people. The question is, why are we here today, really? And I got together with Phil, and we were talking at the funeral about some of the things that had come out in the newspaper and other stories about cases that Phil had worked on. And Phil told me that the family really enjoyed hearing those, because Phil never talked about them when you came home. Phil would play catch with kids, he'd take you out someplace, go to a ball game or whatever.
Play horse.
There you go. But he didn't talk much about work, and they were just enjoying hearing that he was involved in these big cases that some of them are so young, the cases occurred before they were around even. So he asked me if there was an opportunity that I could come over, I guess, get together with him and some of the family members at his house and talk about cases. And I thought about that, and I said, I have a better idea. First of all, it's such a big group, better to bring them to a place like this, and Judy made it available for us to be able to do this, made this facility available. And also, I'm not the only one that has stories about Phil. I was able to gather this group over here, and there were many more that either couldn't come for some reason or unavailable that wanted to come up and talk about it. So frankly, if everybody were here that had stories about Phil, we'd probably be here for the entire weekend. But anyway, let me turn it over to Judy to say a few words, and then we'll get into the program.
Yeah, first of all, you're all welcome here. We're privileged to be able to have Bill's family here. Let me explain a little bit about the firm, which is called James Hoyer. There is nobody named James Hoyer or Jim Hoyer. James was Bill James, who was the federal prosecutor in charge of the Tampa office in the 70s, until about early 1981 or so. And he ran for state attorney and became the elected state attorney. Hoyer can refer either to me or my husband Chris Hoyer when we wanted to name the firm. No matter how we did it with two Hoyers in it, it sounded like you were yodeling. So we said, yeah, just put one in there, and you can think whoever it is. Now my daughter is practicing law here in this firm, so she's all puffed up when she goes to a new place, and James Hoyer is on her business card, and they think she's the owner of the firm. When Bill ran for state attorney, Chris went over to the state attorney's office and was his chief assistant. I had been doing primarily economic crime at the U.S. Attorney's Office, working a lot with Bill and the FBI, but I went over too and started a financial crimes unit at the state attorney's office. Bill served 2 terms and then was turned out of office by the voters of Hillsborough County. So Chris and I and Bill decided that we would start this firm. So that's who the James Hoyer is. And you all know what your dad was like, and he's been described in the paper as the typical or the prototype of a G-man. And he was. He was handsome, and he was quiet, and he had that reserve. And when he talked to you, he would kind of lean in close, and he had that New York voice going on, and he'd drop his voice just a little bit, and he'd take your hand, and then he'd get just a little closer. And so he could be saying something as innocuous as, the donuts are really good, but it would come out like, and the other thing was that he was the only other person besides my best friend and college roommate who ever called me Jude. He never asked, I never told him. It would just be, hey Jude.
Hey Jude, that's a song.
And everybody across the room would think he was saying, "We found Hoffa's body." And then you've heard his eyes, there's no other way to describe them except the steely blue eyes. If he added something to the donuts are good, it would look like this. The coffee's good too. But the guy across the room would be thinking he was saying, "And we know you did it." When I met Phil, I was Judy Schropp. I came to the U.S. Attorney's Office as Judy Schropp, and it would be 6 years in the Florida Power case later when I became Judy Hoyer. At that time, or after that time when I had children, Phil approached me one time and said, "You know, I'd like to come by your house on Christmas Eve." And I thought that was an odd thing for the SAC to say. But it turns out that he and his daughters would dress up and go around to houses on Christmas Eve. So for 3 wonderful years, he would come to my house and thrill my children, who were aged 3 and 4 and then up to 6 and 7. And the last time that he came, Jessie was on the verge of that skepticism that creeps in. And when he left, she said, "Mom, was that the real Santa Claus, not like the ones at the mall?" And I said, "Well, if it wasn't, I don't know who it was." And she said, "Well, I think it was." And I said, "Why do you think that?" She said, "Because he had real boots." And that sums it up. You know, Phil was the real deal. He really was. And it was an honor and a privilege to know him and to work with him. And it's a privilege to have you all here. And so, welcome.
Thank you.
On behalf of the family, thank you for allowing us to be here and to present here. And I just want to ask you one question though. You never got a punch in the ribs when he said
Oh
that?
my God.
He didn't do it to be
They
nice.
didn't do it to you, they do it to
Ladies, they get the punch?
I did.
Judy's talk reminded me of something also. He, like many of us, he came to our house dressed as Santa at Christmas time. I remember Emily being one of the elves, and I think towards the end Kenny was an elf too. He'd show up in a
That's just natural.
I video that.
show up in a red pickup truck, and one year we had a fireplace in our house, which of course down here is rarely used, but I thought of it, I knew he was coming, I thought it would kind of be neat, even though we really didn't need it, to set a fire in there. When Phil came in dressed as Santa, he said, "Where am I gonna sit?" And I said, "Over here." He said, "No, I wanna sit in front of the fire." Okay, and I moved the chair over there, and he sat there, and he put the kids up on his lap. And he stayed, and he was talking with her, and the sweat. And he just, it was coming off his nose and down his forehead, and he just kept going over there. So another great memory that Judy reminded me of. Today, you know, as everybody goes through the cases, you know, I want everybody to interact. So if you have a question, feel free to ask it, or an observation or something that comes up and makes it more colorful. I know things come to mind just as they did now as we're going along, and somebody says something that triggers something else in your own mind. I just want to say I first met Phil on January the 3rd, 1977. We both had been transferred to Tampa. He was coming for the second time. I was coming for the first time. He was coming as the SAC. I was coming as an agent. And we were both met by Ginny Arwine. Joe Arwine was an older agent in the office at the time. And I thought, what a nice thing for Joe to come out and meet me at the airport. And then I found out that his wife was a realtor and he was trying to sell my house, which they did eventually. But she had one area that she worked in Carrollwood Village, that she was selling houses and very successful at it. And we saw a house and we liked it right away. And then a few days later, she told me, we got together for something, and she said, "Oh, Phil McNiff, the SAC, he's looking at a house about 4 houses down from you." And I went, "Oh, damn, how am I ever going to come home for lunch?" But then as the years went by and I got friendly with Phil and knew what he was all about and everything, I kind of regretted that he didn't take that house, and we were neighbors on the same block. But anyway, I sent around kind of a tentative agenda about the cases we're going to talk to, and as Ron mentioned earlier, he probably goes back the furthest, is time-wise over here anyway. So I thought I'd like for him to talk about his experiences with Phil while Phil was his new agent's counselor. And Ron brought around a photograph, which I copied if you pass it. And I'm sure he can tell you who the people are, and there you will recognize Phil right away. But Ron, why don't you go ahead and give your story?
Yes, you know, whenever new agents class is formed, right away they're assigned what's called new agents class counselor. And really less than 1% of agents will ever get that job. And I like to think that somewhere back in the bureau they had a casting department like they did for John Wayne and said, okay, this is the kind of guy we want to be the mentor for the new agents coming into the bureau. Because when you first see Phil, you think, man, there is John Wayne of the FBI. And that's the impression you get when you first meet him. And you hear a little bit from other people about his other background, the cases he had when he was what's called street agent. And of course, that was before he came to us. Phil would have been 40 years old when he was our new agent's counselor. And the person on the far left of the picture is a guy named Mr. Casper. And he was in charge of the training division, assistant director in charge of training. There couldn't have been two different people in the world than Casper and Phil in the way they treated you. Mr. Casper was a kind of guy, scared to death of Phil. The first time you meet him, you know, here's a guy that he likes people. And, you know, he's not a guy to be afraid of. It was kind of like a drill instructor that you had in the Marine Corps. You think, oh, this is going to be bad. And it was bad. Phil, he was there to help you. Whatever you needed, he would help you. And that's why they were assigned. And they were your first role model, the person you would see. And of course, all the guys in the class like, man, if I could just be like this guy when I finished training. And training was 4 months long. So you were with him 4 months. And this picture represents the fact that he went out of his way to give the wives a tour of the Bureau facilities and tell them what was going on. My wife is kind of peeking out like third from the right side. You can barely see her at the time, but that was my wife. And of course the wives got to know him then too. I remember, you know, one of the things, we had to go down to Quantico for 2 weeks of training. And I remember Phil getting on the bus with us. He could have driven his own car down there if he wanted to. But, you know, he was a guy kind of guy. And he just hopped on the bus with us agents, new trainees, and away we went down. They did not have the FBI Academy at that time. And so our training was at the old post office building. And it was old. And I don't know if you ever went in there when it was the old post office building. Did any of the children get to go in there? No. Well, it's kind of like when you got on the elevator there, you thought of that Disney World ride or a horror movie that was going to fall down and break or something. And I don't know, the other guys got to train in the old post office building. Yeah, like I say, it was very old, but we had a good time there, which meant that Phil was there with us, and that the families could come to Washington because that's where he lived. The new agents now, they cannot live or have their families there because they actually live at the academy for the 4 months. We were able to bring the families if we could at that time. And of course, back then, 1966, Hoover was still the director. And of course, Phil spent most of his career under Mr. Hoover. And things changed quite a bit when Mr. Hoover died. And then they started allowing ladies to come in and be agents then. So that's kind of when that changed, 1972. When he died, then the women were able to come in. That's why you only see wives here and no husbands in the picture. Any spouses for certain than just women. I say he was your mentor, role model. I couldn't have asked for better. And then I was lucky enough that on my third office, which was Tampa, I came here and there was Phil as the ASAC. I thought, oh boy, thank goodness. And then luckily he came back again when I was here, still here as the SAC. And of course I stayed here and he stayed here too. And you know, Judy and Al kind of took some of my thunder about, you know, how I thought he was a tough guy, but he was so gentle too. And you think, you know, how can you have both the tough guy and a gentle guy in the same person. But he was, and I don't know what happened to you kids when you were bad and how he disciplined you and what, but I assume that he did something. He had that stern
We were all
part.
never bad.
Oh!
That's my mother.
But I assume if he did give you a spanking or something, or, an hour later, you still loved him to death. And I don't know if he was like that at home too, but I always thought he was having a gentle smile. That was one of the things I thought about him. That wasn't boisterous or something, but he just had that, when he saw you, he talked to you. In the Bureau, you'll have between, an average day, you'll have between about 8 and 12 SACs during their career. And you always remember that one SAC that's so much above everybody else, and that was him. I mean, no question. And if everybody ever asked us who was your favorite SAC, I can't imagine anybody naming anybody else, because I can't imagine anybody else was as good as Phil. And so that was him as a New Agents counselor. Do you have any questions about that time period, or anything you'd like to know?
Well, if it occurs to you later and you have something, you can certainly ask later on.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ron.
Well, they come next to
Yeah, I just wanted to mention about the old post office over there. If you've been to Washington, it's the third highest structure. They won't let anybody build anything that high again. It's the only higher structures in downtown Washington, the Washington Monument, the Capitol Building, and then when you drive by, you see this old tower standing up there, and now it's becoming another Trump hotel. Trump took it over, and he's in the process of converting it to a luxury hotel. Okay, what were you gonna?
I think I'm next to you.
Okay, I was going to, actually, let me see on here. Yeah, okay, you're gonna talk about the shootout, and I brought Jim to talk about that too. And when Phil was here as ASAC, it was in the paper, there was this group that was prevalent throughout the country. It was kind of an offshoot. I was in New York at the time, and I read about it almost on a daily basis. It was an offshoot of the Black Panther Party. It was a group called the Black Liberation Army. They were more violent even, and there were random killings of policemen in New York and other areas. And several of the group were involved in a bank robbery in Atlanta. And got a tip that they were down here by the Tampa airport, and that's where they're gonna pick up the story. But I did a little research about it myself. And it's an interesting fact that when they were involved in that bank robbery in Atlanta, which led to the shootout down here, there was a woman named Joanne Chesimard that was part of the Black Panther Party that had been with them in Atlanta. They could never pin the bank robbery on her. She was eventually charged with other things later on, but not that bank robbery. But she was probably part of the group that was involved in the shootout here. Now, Joanne Chesimard, as I say, she was tried on other charges. She was convicted, sent away to prison, escaped from prison. She had been involved in the shooting, killing of a state trooper in New Jersey. I think it was something to do with a robbery, an armored car robbery, another bank robbery. But she's currently a fugitive in Cuba. And she's been in the news recently because with this bridge that they're trying to establish now with Cuba, one of the demands has been, we want you to give back Joanne Chesimard, who all these years has been living in Cuba as a fugitive of the United States. Cuba's reluctant to do that, various political reasons and everything, but she's in the news today, and this story that they're going to talk about now has a link with her, so there's still some relevancy today. So Ron, why don't you kick it off, and then Jim can jump in and tell what he knows about it.
Okay. The Black Panther Party was formed in 1966, and they called themselves the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Well, the only people that need self-defense was the rest of the people from the Black Panther Party, because they quickly became what I would call thugs and outlaws. And one of the things that they were famous for was ambushing police officers and killing them. And they killed several police officers in the 60s and early 70s. And you have to remember, down south here, it was fairly still segregated at that time. Well, the Black Panthers, when they were in this area, they liked to stay at a hotel in Odessa. You know, Odessa is right in the southeast part of Pasco County, just the northeast of northwest unit of Hillsborough County. And there was an old hotel there, a motel called Walker's Motel. And that's where black people, when they came to this area, stayed, because it was a segregated South. And the Black Panthers stayed there too. And as Al said, they got a tip that these guys were holed up there. And so there were no SWAT teams at that time. If there had been SWAT teams, they would have called in a SWAT team. But when there were no SWAT teams, either the SAC or ASAC or both were put in charge of a group of guys, and they just kind of would get whoever's there. And it was really out, the St. Pete RA Resident Agency was the territory where they were holed up in. And so they got together, the guys, and like I said, the Black Panthers were violent. They'd already killed police officers. What happened when the agents got there, they didn't want to be taken captive because they were wanted already for murder and bank robbery. And so they decided they would shoot it out. And so they started shooting it out. And I was not there, but of course, being in the office, you always hear what happened there. And they were talking about all the bullets whizzing by all the agents when they were chasing these guys, including your father and grandfather. And that was probably one of the times that he was most likely to have been killed. But fortunately, one of the agents then managed to shoot and kill one of the Black Panthers. And that kind of ended the shootout at that time. But it was extremely dangerous. Like I say, there were no SWAT teams. The everyday agent was called upon then to go out there, but when it was going to be that dangerous a situation, they always had the ASAC or SAC join and lead the party. And so, thank goodness they missed for all of you guys.
You know, was John Rutland involved with that?
Probably.
Because
yes.
I know for a long time, he was I forgot what, yeah, our resident agent over there.
Yeah, and it was in the St. Pete RA territory where that happened, because it was Pasco County. And sad part of the story was that the agent that killed the Black Panther later turned out to be a rogue agent, and he got put in prison for burglarizing a credit union in Washington, D.C., named Ed Tickle. But he was a nice guy when he was here. Once he got transferred to Washington, I don't know what happened. But that's an outcome of the story there. And if you have any further questions, I can tell you about that, other than, thank goodness, none of the agents were hit.
Actually, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
I was actually gonna go back to the.
Oh, picture? Yes.
Yeah. So when they had the new trainings, because I know obviously now there are different FBI agents in different groupings, whether they be dealing with economical crimes or burglary crimes.
Right.
So during this time period, did they have the different divisions, or was everyone pretty much trained the same way?
No, you wouldn't be assigned until you reached your first office, and,
Okay.
and then you would be put on a squad that did different things. Like I always was on white collar crime squad, and Judy was always the prosecutor. And let me say before I forget, she and her husband were the best prosecutors in the world. I mean, we worked so many, Al and I worked so many cases with them. Oh, shouldn't, what did Greg do? Greg came later. He was after I was retired.
Well, we were until Greg came along.
Oh, that's right, yeah. But it was such a pleasure, working with them, and then once they came here and did the law firm, I was the first investigator to work for the law firm. And then Al and a couple other guys came along later, so we've been very tight for a very long time, all of us. And of course, like you said, Phil was the agent in charge during some of these investigations you're going to hear. I was involved in some of them, but I'm gonna let the other guys have their turn here.
So the early classes for new agents wasn't down, it wasn't on, the,
Quantico. Well, the only time you went down to Quantico was basically for firearms training. And you went when you first came in, and then about halfway through your training, you went back again for a couple of weeks. And of course, the counselor went with us when we went back again.
because I know the second time he taught, it was down in Quantico.
Yes, and so I was in his first class, the first time that he was a thing. But you know, only a very small percent of us guys got to be his agents. He was a new agents counselor. I feel so fortunate to have run across him these 3 separate times. And like I say, he was above everybody else that was a SAC.
about that motel. My father was working for George at the time, and he had some business down at the racetrack. So I had gone with him because I liked the horses. And we were driving back through Odessa, and all of a sudden, my father just brakes, and he backs up, and he pulls into this dirt lot. And he jumps out of the car, and I'm sitting there like, what is happening? And he goes, get out, and I'm thinking, what? So I go to the front of the car, and I'm standing there, and I'm watching my father reenact that whole Panther thing. Now, he never spoke of work, ever. And now I'm watching my father, like a little boy, telling me there were 2 men there, 1 person hiding there, 1 came through the door here, and I had 2 agents here. And he reenacted the entire thing, and I just stood there watching him, and it was just amazing. And I never heard him say who it was, and it wasn't until the article came out in the paper that I put our experience in Odessa to, it was actually the Black Liberation. Yeah, so it was.
Did he mention he got shot at?
Yes, he did,
Oh, okay.
actually. Because up until that day, the only thing I knew is when Dad was in a precarious situation related to work, we would all say the rosary. And I knew he wasn't coming home.
You must
We
have
had
said a lot of
if we,
rosaries.
if we had scrambled eggs, I knew Dad wasn't coming home tonight. Because we would have breakfast for dinner. And that's all we knew about Dad. That's all I knew, being the youngest, about my dad in the FBI.
Oh, yeah, there's a lot of nights when what's called the night clerk would have to call all the wives and say, okay, your husbands aren't coming home tonight, they're going to be chasing this or chasing that, and your wife would get the phone call. And then it was nice that they did that, to notify all the wives that, hey, you're not gonna be home tonight. And they would make that call, and you'd be on and going.
Jim, did you have something that you might be able to add about that?
Yeah, I moved back to Tampa in 1970, and we were neighbors in Carrollwood, and Joe Santiana introduced me to Phil. And Joe was very gracious when I moved back to the neighborhood. He used to invite me to his house to parties. I found out that all the snitches were in the office. All the squealers would be there at the party. But at any rate,
Phil, you were there.
That's right. So at any rate, I was kind of like the resident agent, the resident expert on the Black Panthers, and Phil and I used to discuss it all the time. Because when I was in New York, I was assigned to the Black Terrorist Squad, also known as Ruckles Raiders, a prestigious squad. As a matter of fact, talking about wife's tours, Joanne went to the office one time for the tour, and she got on the elevator, and 2 agents got on, and one said, you hear about the guy who got transferred in from Hazard, Kentucky, and he got assigned to Ruckles Squad. And the other guy said, he must be a born loser. She agreed. But at any rate, Phil, there hasn't been anybody left that was on the raid that's here today, but Phil told me about it right afterwards. And it was a great story because I'm probably one of the few people that can speak with an accent like Phil's. And as you know, Phil could go out on the range any day of the week and shoot a perfect score. He had which is called a possible, which very few people in the Bureau can do. But he was a great athlete and a great leader like that. And in the FBI manual it says, when there's practical use of firearms is a probability, the senior agent or the SAC will take personal charge. Phil always took those words seriously. A lot of the fellas didn't. A lot of the guys would hide under the desk. But those are different kind of SACs. He was always a leader, and that's why people always looked up to him. And as Phil was telling me the story, he said, the guy is running, he said, and I'm shooting at him. And all you can hear is pop, 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 and the guy is still running. He said, and then Ed Tickle was next to me with the shotgun, and you hear boom, whop, and down he goes. And Tickle turned to Phil and said, you gotta lead him just like a deer. Phil said, there weren't any deer in Brooklyn. But Phil was a great person. When Phil was transferred to Washington as an inspector, we moved to Washington at the time, and I was with the Purelator Corporation. And one great story, we all went, we had a company apartment in the Watergate Hotel. So we all met there and went for dinner. It was John Hanlon and his wife and Phil and Iris and Joanne and me. And that happened to be the same weekend that our good friends went into the Watergate. So at any rate, if you remember, most of them were from Florida. And I was from Florida, most of them were Republicans. And that night, when they made the first run, was the night we all met at the Watergate apartment and went out to dinner. So after that, Phil, I used to like the kid Phil. I'd say, Phil, Phil was kind of serious. I say, Phil, I don't hope this doesn't upset you. I was the lookout that night. So, yeah, I said, they're all guys from Florida, all the Cuban guys from Florida, McCoy and the different guys. I said, I was the lookout. I hope that won't upset you. And after that, Watergate started to get a little more serious. And he said, knock off that stuff about the lookout. But he was a great man, and he was just a pleasure to know, and a delightful person to have as a friend. And I always remember when Phil, one of the lawyers downtown said to me that Mr. Steinbrenner was looking for somebody as his #1 guy. And there had been a guy there before by the name of Bruce Poston who worked for Mr. Steinbrenner. And he had been knocking down, he'd put Mr. Steinbrenner into a deal, he'd get a little kickback for it or something like that. He put him into that coal deal and oil deal in Ohio, and he was just a sleazebag. So Harvard MBA, this guy lawyer said to me that he's looking for somebody as assistant. And I said, does he have to know a lot about business? And he said, no, he just wants somebody who's 100% loyal. That's Phil McNiff. That was Phil McNiff. And he was a person that was a pleasure to know, a pleasure to have as a friend. And like I said, he was a legend in the FBI and a great guy.
Yeah, thanks. Great stories. Specifically asked Jim to come along because he's one of the best storytellers I know. And most of it's true.
Yeah, is that motel still there? Because I remember going by a couple of years ago, it was still there.
I read the paper a year or two ago, they're thinking about raising it.
That's right.
But it's a
Boy Scout
historical.
Road there. That's Boy Scout Road.
It was sort of black hotel.
All right.
Right on your
Way
right,
back when.
up where all that St. Pete, water storage, what do they call it?
Yeah, I just read an article in the paper 2 years ago, they were thinking about raising it, but I don't
When
know.
I last saw it, it was visible. I don't know, if somebody's interested, they could drive up there.
We'll have to get an historical marker put up here. The fellow's name that was killed, the Black Panther, was Fred Fields. Was his name, Fred Fields. Okay, moving on to the next one, then I think maybe after this, we'll take a couple of breaks, so everybody can go to the restroom. You gotta drink up that coffee and eat those donuts because I'm not taking them home with me. But I want to talk about a case that I was involved in, Phil, that I got to talk to the press about. I came, as I said, on the same day he did, in January of 1977. Just 3 months later, a case came to fruition that had been developing for a while. We had an informant, the FBI had an informant in Orlando that was an art dealer. And he was approached by some people trying to sell what was purported to be a Van Dyke and some other valuable artworks, and smelled a rat, and he called his handler in Orlando, and then we worked in an agent that was on our squad at the time, a fellow named George Wilson. George is now 84 years old. I invited him to come today. He planned to come, but he has a bad hip and it hurt him too much. He's probably gonna have to get a hip replacement, but he very much wanted to be here, and I wanted him to tell his side of the story because he was actually the one that negotiated the deal. But in that deal, where they worked it out in the end, where we were going, George was going to buy, as an undercover art dealer, he was going to buy the stolen art in a little motel on Treasure Island over by St. Pete. And on the day of the exchange, we brought some cash for show money, and they were supposed to show up with the paintings. Got there ahead of time, and of course Phil was, again, as already said, every time there was something important going on, Phil was there, unlike maybe some others. And we had set up we had a camper, like a mobile home, and we had a number of agents that were in there. We had parked that in the parking lot. It was pretty innocuous. We got the manager of the motel to give us some rooms around the one room where everything was going down. We had that one room wired so we could get evidence or conversation. And at the prearranged moment, they had some discussion, it was recorded, and they went back out to the car to open the trunk and actually take out the paintings. That's when Phil called, gave the signal on the radio, and everybody came out. It looked like the OK Corral. They were coming out from all sides, and there were 3 of them that were involved in the thefts, and they were all standing there in the middle of this, with Bob Burrish and all these people standing with shotguns pointed at them. And their first move when Phil yelled out, "Stop, FBI," was that they all turned and reached to their waists, and some of them pulled out guns, and to this day I can still see it in my mind's eye. I don't know why they all weren't killed on the spot. There was some great discipline shown here. But when they swiveled around and they looked and saw what happened, all of them dropped their guns. Phil yelled for them all to get down. They were searched, they were handcuffed, and at one point, and just to digress here, it was part of the story that I think is an interesting one. Phil pointed to me and another agent, Steve O'Keefe, and he said, "Take this one." It wasn't the one that we had arrested. We had patted ours down and handcuffed him in the back, as you're supposed to do if you're going to transport them. And this was arrested. This individual was arrested by another agent and had cuffed him in the front and put him down on the sidewalk. Should say that by this time, there were a lot of elderly people that were coming out of the motel and surrounding condos, and they were all standing there. And as we cuffed them and we were picking them up, they were all applauding. It was the best show in town that they had, and they wanted it to go on for a while. Well, anyway, when Phil pointed to one person, he said, "Al, you and Steve take him back to the office." So we stood him up. He was cuffed in front, as I say. And Steve O'Keefe, who was a former Green Beret and on our SWAT team and everything, a very experienced and meticulous agent, he said to Phil, has this guy been searched? Because we assumed he was, but we weren't the ones that arrested him. And somebody yelled out, "Yeah, he's clean." But O'Keefe, being the agent that he was, decided, well, I'm going to search him anyway. And I said, "Man, Steve's putting on a show for all these people that are standing around here, and he's patting them down over there, and everybody's watching." And he gets down to his crotch, and Steve starts yelling at the top of his lungs. I go, "Man, Steve's lost it. What's going on here?" Steve pulls open his belt, pulls down his zipper, pulls down his pants, reaches in his underwear, and pulls out a little 9mm gun that he had concealed in his underwear. And of course, at the time, you had a lot going on, and then you have a chance to reflect later on. I was thinking, Steve drove back. I was sitting with this guy in the back seat, and had his handcuffed in front, which of course we changed later on, and had access to his gun. And again, you think of the moments when you might not be here today, but for your fellow agents looking out for you. In this case, Steve did. Anyway, that was a bit of a digression. So we took these people back, and we recovered guns and masks and bulletproof vests and Halloween masks, everything that they had. I mean, they were clearly bad people, but we didn't know how bad until fingerprinted them and sent some of the guns off to the FBI laboratory where they did ballistics tests on them, and they found out that this group had been involved in home invasions and robberies all up and down the East Coast. 2 of them were on parole for murder at Walpole Prison in Massachusetts. And they had shot a state trooper. They didn't know who had done it until the guns came in. They did the ballistics, but they shot a state trooper in the stomach in Delaware who lived. They were involved in a kneecapping of an elderly 70-year-old man. They went into a home invasion. They had a tip that he had a safe in the house, and told his wife to open it, and she wouldn't open it, so they shot him in the kneecaps. She eventually opened it, we terrorized him. So anyway, they matched all this stuff up, we put all these cases together, myself and Ed Krieger, who recently died last year, retired agent, and we spent the better part of the rest of 1978, part of 1979 testifying in trials all up and down the East Coast, Maryland, Delaware, and back to Walpole. There's stories about this in a little packet I put together for everybody later on, and you can review it. But it turned out that the ringleader was a fellow named Petey Wilson, who was part of some of these big Irish gangs that they had in Boston at the time, and Petey was interesting in his own right. He's still in jail today as a result. Checked recently, his release date is something like 2028 if he lives that long. But he actually was the person that killed the Boston Strangler. Boston Strangler was a fellow named Albert DeSalvo, and again, many of you are too young to remember it, but it was another case where people were being killed in the Boston, Massachusetts area, murdered women, and they sentenced us, or they convicted this guy, Albert DeSalvo, was the killer, although there's still a controversy today as to whether he's the person. It's pretty certain he was. But anyway, he and Petey Wilson, the fellow that we arrested that day in St. Petersburg, they were in jail together in the state pen in Walpole. And DeSalvo was taking a shower, and Petey walked into the shower. He was the only other person in the shower. When he came out, DeSalvo was dead. And they tried Petey 3 times, and all 3 times he was acquitted because nobody else would testify, and Petey wouldn't testify, and the only forensics they had were the shiv that was a handmade shiv. There were no fingerprints because of the shower and everything, and so they had to parole him, and that's why he was out that day. So kind of an interesting case. I mentioned before that, trying to do this chronologically, that Marty couldn't come today, but he asked me, he sent a little note, and he asked me to read this to everybody, a little vignette story that he had involving Phil, and when I'm done, as I said, we took a couple-minute break. But he said in 1978, Special Agent in Charge Phil McNiff summoned me to his office, and he asked if I played handball. I guess knowing Marty was from Brooklyn, that was a given, and I said, I do. He then said, well, how about a game tomorrow morning at the courthouse on Del Mabry at 6 a.m. before we go to work? I was a little stunned at the 6 a.m. time, but how could I say no? So the next morning I went down to the gym, and there he is, already warmed up and ready. Well, for the next hour, he proceeded to engage me in the most aggressive physical combat I'd ever been involved in. During the match, rather than having to call a hinder, if somebody gets in your way, you're allowed to yell that out. He told me he had done that so many times with Phil that he decided not to call him anymore. Instead of calling a hinder, as he was crowding me, I swung at the ball with my left fist for a ball that was coming up the wall with all my might and slammed right into Phil's jaw. Instead of falling down as you would expect, he turned around and looked at me and gave me one of those looks, but never said a word. And I was thinking, what in the world did I just do? We finished up, and prior to departing for the office, Phil wanted to set up another handball game the next day. I bravely told him I was a night person and I could not, and this was after work, and I could not meet him after work. One early morning meeting I missed as I overslept, so that ended the 6 a.m. games. Phil won the gold medal at the Florida Police Olympics on at least 2 occasions for handball while he was the SAC in Tampa. He was aggressive, physical, skilled, and ambidextrous at handball, and I believe that was his favorite sport. But it became difficult to find partners as so many of the young guys were going to racquetball. Only ones left playing handball were some people from New York and a couple of military guys from McGill Air Force Base. And of course, I could not invite my SAC to play down there, as all the other agents would have gone bonkers. See the boss come in while they were all sneaking on to play handball. Phil grew up in St. Thomas Aquinas Parish in Brooklyn at 4th Avenue and 9th Street, which at the time was largely Irish and Italian, and was situated just 4 blocks from the waterfront in Prospect Park. It was a working class neighborhood with very tough guys. I found out years later that the Persico and the Gallo gangs, part of the Profaci and later Colombo families, had clubhouses on 4th Avenue not far from the church, which sponsored the CYO basketball and baseball teams, which were king in the neighborhood. Phil went on to St. Michael's Diocesan High School in Bay Ridge, Brooklyn. In order to get into St. Michael's, you had to pass a test, and the highest scores of only 1 or 2 in each parish received a scholarship and free tuition, which Phil did. He went on to play basketball and baseball and eventually entered the school's Sports Hall of Fame, and he attended the induction ceremony. Phil, as a youth, was a Dodger fan and attended many games at Ebbets Field, as did every other Brooklyn kid. And it was just walking distance from our neighborhood. A gentleman, a sports fan, a devout Catholic, a family man, a patriot, and a wonderful boss, and an even better friend, Marty Boland. So, does anybody have any questions about what went on so far? I think I probably split it right in half over here, so we can take a restroom break. The restrooms are out the door. Ladies to the right, men to the left, and the coffee and the donuts are out there. We'll get back here in about 5 or 10 minutes.
Great, so he wasn't lying when he told us to look at his report card.
Did
Did you ever know he got
It
that?
didn't.
Can I tell you a story about my dad?
No, I didn't.
Was it high school? No, college.
College.
We had to
Yeah,
take-
yeah.
Yeah, Spanish, right, go ahead.
No, no.
That, we had to have one foreign language or one semester of.
Lunch dates together. Let me interrupt you a minute.
Sure. I'll do that.
Picking up-
Look here, ready?
I know you do. Picking up where we left off with the Spanish, there is a newspaper in Tampa, which is the only trilingual newspaper in apparently the world, Spanish, Italian, and English, La Gazzetta. And they are not known for being nice to people of our ilk, but they put a nice thing about your father in here, saying that Tampa has lost one of its favorite adopted sons. Now, to be Irish and be mentioned in this column is something, but to be mentioned favorably. So I saved that, and you all can have a copy of that to put with your packets if you want.
There's actually 2 articles in that same, there's another one later on that's a great commentary as well that I've got a copy of, that I'll pass on.
And let me just add to what Ron was saying about mentoring. There were 2 things that Phil always did with at least my cases. When he knew you were going to trial and it was past the point where anybody's going to try and work a plea agreement, he would call. And he'd call me and he'd say, Jude, is there anything I can do to help you? You okay? Fine, Phil, we're doing that. And then afterwards, he would always either call or personally come downstairs to our office and say, good job, and often write a note from my personnel file to the same effect. But he never forgot to offer that encouragement and that support beforehand, and then to say something afterwards. So, anyway.
Let me say something again too. Some of you met Barry Cohen at the funeral services. Barry was our nemesis. He was a defense attorney who was like an enemy to the FBI. But he made a point to come to Phil's service because he knew that if the trial was going to go on and he had a defendant, he was going to get a fair shake when Phil was in charge. And so that's another testament. But he's still our nemesis.
Great one-liner Phil had in your Florida Power case, when they were gonna lock the president.
Wait, save that, because when we talk about the Florida Power case, I was going to call on you.
No.
That would fit in better than.
I don't know, but so the defense attorney calls in and says, understand you want my man.
He wants to tell you more than just the line.
What?
I wanted to save
He's
that
gonna
for
cue
the
you.
end of the story that we're going into right now.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
okay.
okay.
I could never
Yeah,
get
this
this full
is
play
somebody
straight either.
You're not still going, are you? No. Okay, in 1978, I'm trying to do this chronologically again, Phil called me and the supervisor we had at the time, I think it was Tony Daniels, down to his office along with Ron Jordan. And first time I met Chris Hoyer, who was prosecutor at the time, assistant United States attorney. And Chris had with him a state's attorney, assistant state's attorney from Pinellasville named Marvin Rudnick. And they were talking about this case that had been in the paper in what was then the St. Pete Times on almost a daily basis. It was the era where we had the first Arab oil embargo, and there were lines all around gas stations, and it was creating great turmoil in this country. And everybody was looking for a reason this was happening, because a lot of people, and I think rightfully so, were suspecting that people were using this opportunity to gouge the public. not only with gasoline, but heating fuels and other things. And this Marvin Rudnick had on his own come across some information that he put together, playing around in his spare time, indicating that the fuel that Florida Power Corporation over in St. Petersburg, headquartered over there, that they were buying was being the cost was being exaggerated. In order to try to keep a lid on prices, the government, U.S. government, had passed a law saying essentially that if you resold oil during this period of time, you couldn't make more than a 10% profit on the sale. So what a group of oil men in Houston had done was they created 6 different companies that were just paper companies, and then they make it appear that they sold and resold and resold, and when they were done, they jacked up the price by 60%. And of course, that was a big profit to them because these were their companies. But in order to make this work, they had to have somebody at the Florida Power Corporation approving the purchases, because Florida Power could go out on the open market and buy this at a cheaper price. So we had to have somebody on the inside of Florida Power that was going to be create a ready market for our jacked up fuel prices. And that person that they got to was the president of Florida Power Corporation, Angel Perez. And Marvin put this all together. He brought it in to the United States Attorney's Office. Marvin was the United States Attorney himself at the time, and said, I think there's going to be federal charges in here, and I put this together. And Phil, again, immediately recognized the importance of this, and again, that there were stories insinuating all this stuff that almost on a daily basis at the time in the St. Pete Times. So he saw that it was going to have a high profile, and I was honored that he picked me and Ron to be the co-case agents on that case. And make a very long story short, we ended up charging 5 oil men from Houston, the president and the vice president of Florida Power Corporation with violations of federal law. And case went on for a while. It was tried in actually 3 different sections. We went up to Jacksonville for a period of time, weeks on end, and tried that case. And almost every day I had to check in with Phil because he was watching this, and there was pressure coming from the newspaper to, what's happening. They had reporters up there around the clock reporting on this thing live, daily bulletins and everything. And it really was a big deal. Later on, it made it onto 60 Minutes and Wall Street Journal and Forbes magazine and everything as a big case that we had finally put together, because in essence we had proved what the public was suspecting at the time, that there were people out there taking advantage of the situation. Now, as I say, Ron was a co-case agent. Judy was one of the prosecutors along with Chris on that case. So I asked Ron to go first and talk about your impressions of the case and your connection with Phil or whatever.
Yeah, most cases the FBI agents handle, or one agent handles the case and you got one defendant. And so you work it by yourself, and it's, it may take a month or 2 or 3 to get it worked up. This kind of case, you put a team together because you've got multi-defendants, multi-millions of dollars involved. And what you've got to have is somebody that's going to give you backup when you need to go somewhere else. Most cases, if you have what we call a lead in another state or another place, then you send it to that office, and that office has an agent there working. But this got so complicated that unless you could travel around to these different places yourself and do the work, it just wasn't feasible. And most SACs were very reluctant at that time to approve travel, whatever. But Phil never, ever objected. And you had to go get approval from the SAC to do this. And so by us being able to go anywhere and do this case, it was a tremendous help. Only by the fact that, Phil was backing us the whole way to do this. It was unusual for agents at that time to travel around the country. I mean, it was an unusual thing. I don't know if you've heard the term daisy chaining in a crooked deal. Well, this is what daisy chaining is. These people on paper develop these companies. The first real company, like say Gulf Oil or Texaco, would sell the oil to Company A that they made up. Just on paper, the next company that they own would then buy it for 20 cents a gallon more. And we're talking millions of gallons here. We're not talking, you know, a truckload, we're talking barges. And what would happen, as soon as Florida Power actually bought the oil, the barge from Texas would start on its way over the Gulf of Mexico and would come to Florida. And so, let's say the price was initially $1 a gallon. By the time it got here, it was like $2 a gallon. But the only thing that happened different is that on paper, they would invoice each other, and that's the only work they did, was send an invoice to the next company. And they took all this extra money for themselves then, and of course they bribed the people at Florida Power to do this. And so that's how a daisy chain works. You don't really do any work, you just send out an invoice, and that's it. And you're making millions of dollars off the public, because it's the public that is then gonna pay the rate hike, and of course, the company will say, oh, we had to pay $2 a gallon for this oil, and therefore we need a hike in your rates for the public to pay for this. Well, that will only cost them $1 a gallon, not $2. And all these crooks were then sharing that difference in the $2. And that's what daisy chaining is, and that's what they did. And of course, without the backing of Phil to let us travel and do whatever we needed to do, it would have been very difficult to have done that case.
And I think when you look, I'll give out these packets later on, there are articles about this, but there's a group photograph of everybody that was involved in that case. I think I included in there, there were probably 25 agents from different agencies and everything to show you the size of that case. And again, you know, it was all being run out of this little office in Tampa, and Washington was watching this too, because again, it was very newsworthy and very relevant at the time. Did you have anything you want to add to that?
I came into the case just a little bit late. Al told you about Marvin Rudnick, who was the assistant state attorney from Pinellas County that brought the case. Well, that was 1978, and I had just started in the office in 77. I was like bottom rung of the ladder in the U.S. Attorney's Office. So Chris had asked me to draft jury instructions. By now, I was 6 years old, so I was able to do that. But if you looked up the words loose cannon in the dictionary, you would find a picture of Marvin Rudnick, because he was a loose cannon. And when Chris and Marvin got to trial up in Jacksonville, I think the judge on the bench nearly threw Marvin out of the courtroom. But Chris called down for help, and Mr. James, Bill James, came into me and said, can you go up to Jacksonville and help him out? Right after that, I got a call from Phil saying, I understand you're going up to Jacksonville, do you need anything? And I thought, yeah, I need a lot of stuff, Phil, but I'm not sure you can get it for me right now. But he was great support in that case, which was a lot more complex in proving than it is in reciting, and required a lot of skill in bringing all those pieces together and managing it all, and all with the press looking over your shoulder all the time and trying to get information. So you know more about it than I do, actually. I showed up for trial.
Well, the details are all in those articles that are in the packet that I'm going to give out later on. Now, Jim, you can tell your story.
It's your cue.
When it all came down, Phil was gonna lock up the president of Florida Power, no, you know, rather significant event. So his lawyer calls and says, I'll be happy to bring him in. And Phil said, don't worry about it, we'll come get him. He says, he's not Dillinger, you know. And Phil said, you're right. Dillinger never stole as much money as your client.
Okay, again, chronologically moving along here, while that case was going on, because it took several years to resolve, Tony Daniels, who I mentioned earlier, he was supervisor of the organized crime squad on which Ron and I were assigned at the time. He started another project while we were all caught up with Florida Power, and it was called the Coldwater case, and it got its name, Coldwater, from the principal subject in there, a fellow named Jimmy Aquafrida, aqua frita is cold water. And the idea, and Tony was very ambitious, and again, and he had some good insight as to how to really attack the mafia. And he got together with Phil, and Phil approved the whole idea, which was very innovative, which was we found this club up at Holiday on Highway 19 that was abandoned. It had a couple of tennis courts and a house that had a structure that had a bar in it. And it was like a clubhouse and everything, and they looked at it and said, we can turn this into a bottle club, an after-hours bottle club. And we can get the word out that it's being run by the mob. The FBI headquarters at Quantico, they set down crap tables and things that they had seized during raids so we could stock it down there. It looked pretty good. It looked like a little Las Vegas casino when they put it all together. And we worked it it probably went on for the better part of 5 years. In fact, Phil retired and it was still going on. At one point, we had a lot of evidence against local police and other officials that everybody knew that was going on over there, what was happening. They didn't know that it was an FBI operation, but they thought that it was a mob operation in this Holiday, which is not the biggest town in the world, and so word spreads fast. And they would come in, the police would come in and basically shake down our undercover agents and say, look, we know what's going on here, we're gonna raid it, but we can give you protection. And so we got all that recorded. We got the whole place wired, and we were monitoring it 24 hours a day. And we gathered all this information, and we felt that we got pretty much all we could get in the area. The police department over there was only so big and everything, we pretty much had their captain and everybody else caught up in it. So Tony, with Phil's agreement, reached out to another undercover operation that was going on in New York at the time, involving an agent named Joe Pistone, who was using an undercover name of Donnie Brasco, and you may have heard he wrote a book later on, and then a movie was made out of, a pretty good movie. If you've seen the movie, a lot of the scenes that occur in the movie where they come in and raid the gambling establishment and everything, the movie purports that they all happened in Miami, but in actuality, they were all going on up here, I guess, from movie's sake. They thought it was more colorful to make it in Miami. Most of the action that I described in the latter part of the movie all happened in Holiday. So there came a point where Joe Pistone had integrated his undercover operation with ours, and we started bringing in people from New York and Chicago. Now we were making cases on mob people in other parts of the country, selling stolen property and things like that. And there came a point after we probably passed the 5-year mark, and again, by this time Phil had retired, where they asked Pistone, his handlers in New York, his capo, they asked him they wanted somebody killed in Miami, and they wanted him to do it. And he kept stalling him, coming up with reasons why he couldn't do it. Obviously, he wasn't going to kill anybody. And that went on for a period of time until they started getting suspicious. And then Pistone came in and said, look, I can't stall him anymore. We're going to have to take this down. And they did it. A fellow named Jim Kinney, Jack Case, a couple of other, Mike Lunsford, I think, over in Pinellas, all worked on that case. And they got together with Pistone, and they came up with a scenario to close it all down there. We're going to shut it down, and then we're going to take excerpts and put together a little video with all the hits, the major hits in there. I mean, that hits from Killing, but all the best evidence they had, one after another. And they flew with Pistone up to New York and confronted Pistone's capo and said to him, I'm an FBI agent. They had Pistone walk in with a badge on and everything when he did it. Of course, this capo was absolutely aghast, at what had happened. And they told him, look, you've got the weekend, and we want you to cooperate with us. We have enough information to put you in jail for decades, but we want to get above you, and we need you in order to go to the next level. And so we want an answer by Monday if you're going to cooperate with us. Well, Monday came and went, and nobody saw him again. And then probably a month or so later, a torso was found in a creek in Staten Island, and they were able to establish that that was the capo. But that's pretty much how that case ended, because it wanted to keep it going for another couple of years. But again, another terrific case that was made into a movie and everything that actually Phil had a critical role in starting. There's another case that I put in here. I'm not going to discuss it because I really don't know anything about it. There's an agent, Lakeland, had been there for years, all during the period that Phil was here, and it was involving a fellow named DeGrieve, and DeGrieve was a con man that had come in and established himself in Lakeland, became a prominent businessman working for General Foods, I think probably one of their big orange processing plants, and embezzled $7 million, and on the day that the auditors came, he disappeared and left his wife and kids, had no idea that what had happened or anything, and he just disappeared, and then they, Brooke Roberts had taken his fingerprints, and they found out he was really a fellow from Belgium that had created a whole scenario with regard to his background, said he played football at Notre Dame, big guy in the community and everything, but he wasn't anything that he said he was. He made a lot of press. Phil is mentioned prominently in the clipping that Brooke sent over, discussing who this guy was and how unusual that case was. DeGrieve was eventually arrested, and they put him in jail while he was awaiting extradition to be tried down here. He died in jail, so that the case ended. Justice was served, I guess. Okay, so Phil retires in 1980, and I get a phone call from Phil. Al, I just got back from playing handball or racquetball. Oh, that's great, Phil. And he said, and one of the guys I was playing with is a fellow named Pick Talley. And Pick Talley he was known in the Hillsborough area. He had some low-level jobs with the Hillsborough County Commission, and he was an engineer by trade, and he had gotten together with some land developers, and they were looking for a rezoning permit. And what Pick told Phil was, I'm being shaken down by three Hillsborough, at the time it was only one Hillsborough County Commissioner, Jerry Bulmer. Now, for years before this, everybody knew the names of the three, there were 5 county commissioners, they knew the names of the 3 men who were on that commission, or 3 men, 2 women, Confus, Anderson, and Bulmer, because so many odd things were happening with zoning. I mean, they would grant a permit to put a high-rise in the middle of a residential area. They would put a commercial building where it didn't belong. They'd build a highway through some part of town that it didn't need to go through, but all of their friends were getting paid off through eminent domain, all sorts of weird things. The papers were after them and everything. And so Phil gave us the information about Pick Talley, got together with Pick Talley, put a wire on him, went on negotiations for a while, but he delivered $25,000 to Bulmer. We caught him on tape. We arrested Bulmer when he walked out of Pick's office. He had the money in a suitcase. We handcuffed him. We were ready to take him back to the office, the FBI office downtown at the time. And as soon as he got in the car, he said, I want to cooperate. And we said, well, what kind of cooperation can you give? And he said, I'm supposed to pay 1/3 of this to Codvis and 1/3 to Anderson. And if you let me go back in the morning, wire me up, I'll get them all on tape. And we kept them all night in the hotel, got them up in the morning, cleaned them up, put a wire on them, sent them in, he paid it off. We arrested all 3 of them. It was, to this date, still in my knowledge, and I don't know nobody's refuted it, the most significant corruption case in Hillsborough County, all because Phil played racquetball with Pick Talley. And it just it was an amazing case. It made the Bureau look great. We were getting phone calls and editorials talking about how nobody could have done this but the FBI, and Phil was no longer in the FBI, and he was still making us look good. So that was a terrific major case that we worked in. And again, there was fallout from it that went on for a long time. I know that there are others that played some roles in the case, so does anybody have anything else to add to that summary? Again, there are stories about it in the packet.
Through a strange quirk of fate, that day, the U.S. Attorney was out of town, and the assistant state, or the U.S. Attorney in charge was somewhere else. I was in charge of the office, and I got to authorize the search warrant. And then Chris wound up being the prosecutor. But I also lived next door to one of the female county commissioners, Janet Flatt, at the time. before it became really public, I called Jan. I said, Jan, your nightmare is over. And she said, I can't tell what's going on. There's an awful lot of activity here at the county courthouse. But she said, I'm so happy if it's really over, because she had lived through hell being on the commission with those two guys.
Yeah, and another ramification, years later, Pam Iorio, who was the last or on the current mayor, she was the mayor, and we invited her to speak to our retired agents group several years ago. And she came in and her introduction was something like, I'm so happy to be in front of you because the reason that I'm the mayor today is because of you. You know, and everybody, wow, what was she talking about? And she said, you know, it goes back to this commissioner's case that you had in the early 1980s, and because the fallout of it was that they were able to corrupt 3 of the 5 county commissioners, which gave the majority. So they decided the best way to try to prevent that from happening again was to expand the size of the county commission to make 7. We'll put 2 at-large commissioners on there, because it'll be harder now to get 4, to get a majority and get 4 people that you can bribe. Not impossible, but harder. And so she said, that's when I ran for my first office. I was elected as one of those at-large seats, and then when I finished my term on there, I was reelected, and then I ran for mayor. So interesting that she attributes her career.
Yeah, one other thing, Greg and I arrested Joe Coppas and took him in. Coppas almost became the mayor of Tampa by a few votes at one time. You know, so how scary that would have been if he had actually become the mayor.
And I think an interesting thing about that case too was that it was coming a couple of years, a number of years after the big Abscam case, which was a huge corruption case in the United States that involved the United States senators, representatives.
The American Hustle.
Yeah, that's right, exactly. And the one of the representatives that was key to that case, who was charged and convicted, was a Congressman Kelly in Pasco County. And he was the one that was, if you ever saw the tape, he was stuffing the money in his coat and his jacket, and he was saying, does it show? You know, before he walked out, to see if he could get out with all the cash. And caught on tape. And when he was tried, he used his defense. The defense was that I was conducting my own investigation. I was only taking the money because I intended to go to the FBI later on. And I think it confused some people, but he got convicted in the end. So anyway, we were very aware of that at the time when this case went down. And so, again, we sat down. I guess Chris was intimately involved. He was at strike with Bill James at the time. And we were aware of that, and we said, how are we going to guard against that? And Chris came up with this idea that worked like a charm. And he said, we're going to get search warrants. And after Bomer pays the money to Coppas and Anderson, we're going to come in, or have agents come in armed with search warrants ahead of time, not tell these people that they had search warrants, and then say to Coppas and Anderson, with the FBI, and we're conducting an investigation, and it involves allegations that Jerry Bomer's been taking bribe money. Do you know anything about this? And of course, they said, no, we got them on tape, the agents were wired. And he said, you sure you don't know anything about this? And that was their opportunity to tell the FBI if they were going to use a defense like that down the road. It pretty much prevented them from ever using a defense like that. They said no, and they said, okay, well, we're going to arrest you. And they used these search warrants to open their desk. We went in right after Bomer was there, and we recovered all the money from their desk and everything, and it was still pretty open and shut, and they all went to jail. And Anderson died in jail. Coppas is back in town threatening to run for office every once in a while. Bomer, last thing I heard, I think Bomer died too. He was running a ranch up in North Florida or something. I think he might have died a couple of years ago.
And Chris and I got married.
The measure of the impact was, a friend of mine was the chief of staff to the governor, and I got a call from Hillsborough County. They've just arrested 3 out of 5. The county cannot do business until the governor appoints a replacement. The county was basically shut down.
It's true.
I'll tell you, I had neighbors coming out and shaking my hand on the street and everything. That was a high point for the FBI in this town. Okay, so again, getting to the last item on the agenda, Phil calls me again in 1990, and I know by now. Phil calls, I pick up that phone because he's got a track record with me. And he calls and said, Al, working for George at the time, and got this fellow named Howie Spiro. And Howie, at the time, George was involved in litigation with his left fielder, Dave Winfield. And they were fighting back and forth over contract information, negotiations, and Winfield sued George, and George sued Winfield back. And out of the blue, Howie calls up and says that, got information, Mr. Steinbrenner, that will help your case. So George arranges for him to fly down and meet with Phil, to be debriefed and everything, and he turns over the information. And I think it probably had some merit and might have been useful if the litigation had continued. And George reimburses him for coming down, staying in the hotel, and for his trouble in his time gives him $40,000. And Howie goes away. And a year or more passes, and Winfield and George settle their lawsuits. They dropped them both. They're best friends. Winfield's back playing for the Yankees. Everybody's happy. And Howie sees this in the paper, and he picks up the phone and he calls George and he says, I want the rest of my money. George says, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I figured this was worth $150,000. I've been sitting around waiting, testifying all this time, and so he gave me 40, I need another 110. And George turns it over to Phil and says, Phil, you got a problem here, you got to solve it. And so Phil calls me and says, what do you think, Alan? And I said, well, what is he threatening to do? And he said, well, he's threatening to go to the newspapers and disclose the fact that George, he's going to say that George paid $40,000 in debt money against Winfield. And the federal extortion statute says if there's an interstate aspect to it and you're demanding the payment of money not to hurt somebody or to hurt their reputation, that's a violation of the federal extortion statute. So I told Phil, Phil, this is this federal crime that's going on. He said, I agree with you, and I'll get back with you. Let me go talk to George about how we're going to handle this. And maybe a day went by, and Phil called me back and he said, all right, now we want to go forward with this because we believe if we pay the guy, he's only going to come back and come back and come back again. And it's going to be never ending. And so we went over to George's office, put a wire on his telephone, at the appointed time. And I would say we're going to call back, make further demands. Call back. We got it all on tape, laid it all out. I'm going to go to the newspapers. I'm going to ruin you. You're going to be thrown out of baseball, all this other stuff. So on that basis, we arrest him. Case gets moved to New York. They're going to talk about what happened in the prosecution and everything. At that point, the Yankees were a bad team. They had finished in last place the year before. New York did not like George, mostly because the Yankees weren't winning. And everything that went on through that trial, I think Greg and I might have been the only two, Greg too, that sat through the entire trial because I wasn't going to be a witness, so I saw it all. And every day we were all living together. Phil in the Vista Hotel, which used to be part of the World Trade Center, which was taken down on September 11th, and it was destroyed in the plane crash. And but every day we would walk back and forth, and I'd sit through court the day before, and Greg was doing, it was like Daniel and Lion's Den. They had attorneys on the other side that wanted to take George down, and he was alone on our side, and we were kicking our butts all over the court with our witnesses, with his cross-examination. And yet, every morning we'd get up and pick up the 5 local newspapers, Newsday, Daily News, Post, The Time, and read the stories and think we were losing. We were wondering if we were in the same courtroom with these people. It was a very, very disconcerting situation, and a lot of pressure on Phil at that time. And every morning we would walk from the Vista Hotel over to the Southern District Courthouse and get ready for trial. And Phil would stop on the way to the little chapel nearby, and he'd go in there and pray every morning. And again, it said something about his character and his commitment and everything. And he went on the stand and went through some rigorous cross-examination, and he just sat up there as he did. He wasn't a bit nonplussed, right? He sat there and thoughtfully answered every question that came out as honestly as he could. And in the end, we convicted Howie Spirit. It had come out that Howie Spirit, this wasn't the first time he extorted somebody. He already was a convicted felon for extorting some completely different case years earlier. So he had a propensity for doing this. And I think the citizens of New York, New York FBI, a lot of other people were sitting there scratching their heads because they only knew what was going on from the press and didn't realize that we were winning this case. And when we finally won it, they were, wow, how did you do that? You know, this is a miracle and everything. It was quite an experience because we got to live and work together for three weeks at least over there and back and forth in New York. And we bonded, didn't we?
We did.
So why don't you pick it up, and then if anybody else has anything.
It was, I knew Phil before the case, but obviously, when we were spending all this time together, we spent a lot of time together, and we had a very similar background. We both went to high school in inner city Brooklyn. We went to St. Michael's and played basketball. I went to St. John's Prep in Bed-Stuy. Played baseball at the parade grounds. We played CYO. I mean, we were city kids, unlike Cusack, who was from Long Beach. Long Beach might as well have been Brazil. If you grew up in Brooklyn, nobody went to Long Beach. You went to Brighton Beach, you went to Coney Island, you went to Rockaway. Nobody went to Long Beach. But and so Phil and I talked on so many different levels about just playing sports. We had that friendship and that common bond. You talk about, I think someone mentioned he went to St. Thomas Aquinas, in CYO, I don't know if you've ever been to the St. Thomas Aquinas gym, it's probably not even there anymore, but they used to play in the basement, and they had pillars in the middle of the court, and the guys that were playing for St. Thomas Aquinas knew how to use those pillars, so you'd be going along and got there, and bang, he rapped into it. So I said, so Phil was telling me, we were St. Thomas Aquinas. I said, oh, yeah, you're the guys that you had the pillars in your gym. He says, yeah, we ran everybody. It's like, and Phil's a tough guy too. But this, one of the things that happened in this case that I think was extraordinary, and Greg and I were talking about it. Greg was the case agent, and the most difficult person in America for a defense attorney to cross-examine is that man. Greg Hendrickson, he was the case agent, and his handsome picture from 1980 is in these clippings. But what happened, Al talked about the tape where we got Howie on tape shaking George down. It wasn't just for money, it was threats to his family, it was threats to his children, it was threats to his mother still living in Cleveland. It was pretty horrific what Spiro was about. And I'm not sure if it was Greg or Al or some combination of it, but what they decided to do was, let's do a search warrant at Spiro's house in the Bronx. Let's see what we find there. And Greg went up with some New York agents, and they did a search warrant. And during that search warrant, they took a dozen tapes, Greg? A lot of tapes where, unbeknownst to anybody, Howard Spiro had taped virtually every phone call with your father over a significant period of time. Every phone call. And what was abundantly clear, and Marty Boland, who was the other agent on the case that was with us, was talking about it, was that Phil was the guy who was actually trying to help this person. He tried to treat this guy with compassion, with sympathy. This was before it really got ugly. And we sat there, and I remember Greg and I and Marty would sit there and listen to these tapes, and what we came to understand was that this was a man who lived the Catholic religion when nobody was looking. That he was a guy that was trying to do the right thing when nobody was looking, when nobody knew that he was being taped. He was that kind of human being. And it was extraordinary. It was extraordinary to sit there and listen to see how Phil, unbeknownst to anybody, sometimes late at night, sometimes at home, they would call, that he was doing what he could try to do to try to save this guy. Now, he was unsalvageable at the end of the day, and he was convicted and went to jail. But to see what your father and grandfather had done was just extraordinary to all of us. And what happened during the course of the trial is exactly what Al said. we were not very popular, and George was not very popular. And as a case in point, we had brought George to the grand jury, and we came in through the back. And as we were coming in the back, there was construction going on. Were you with me? Construction going on in another building, and lo and behold, all the construction workers see George Steinbrenner going into the building. Now, they were flashing things at him, but it wasn't, we're number one. They were yelling and screaming, and you know, I mean, it was like, oh, there's your fan base. But we ultimately went to trial, and the media was brutal on us day in and day out, especially one reporter from the New York Times by the name of Murray Chass. He had a particular vendetta against Mr. Steinbrenner that was way, way, way out of bounds. And the only person who chilled that and stopped that, the only person, was your father and your grandfather. Phil took the stand, and mind you, we were getting annihilated day after day after day in the press. Phil took the stand, and we had a day's worth of tapes and transcripts of the conversations between Phil and Howard Spirit. And Phil just methodically went through with his compassion and his desire to try to help this young man, and just to see the progression going down. And it took an entire day. And honestly, you know, everybody talks about this case being about George. No, this case was about your father. This case, your father, what he did that day in the courtroom ended that case for Howard Spirit. All day testimony. The next morning, the New York Times doesn't have an article. And in through the hallway comes Murray Chass. This is the day after Phil had testified at the direct. And I said, Murray, nice article this morning. And he said, oh, I didn't write one. He said, that's the point. That's the point. You write all this stuff, and when you get the transcripts, you see what this guy did to everybody. You don't write anything about it. But it was not a situation that was going to be remedied in the media. But what so impressed me to this day, and is who it was clear Phil McNiff was, not only when you were watching, but when you weren't watching. And I always thought that, and I've told my daughter that many times about Phil, about this was a man who a lot of people talk about living the Christian Catholic life and saying the rosary wasn't coming home. He was doing it when nobody was looking. And I don't think I've ever come across somebody in my career, in my life, with that kind of integrity that changed me to say, my God, this is just an extraordinary human being. You know, and then the Christmas time stuff, you know. I mean, what he did at Christmas time, he continued the tradition coming to my house in South Tampa, and he just driving around. Philip, you came a few times, and one last humorous story was he came, and I remember my daughter and her little friends came in, and their eyes were like, oh my heavens, you know, Santa Claus is here. And one day, he came and left, and he left his bells. Well, do you think it was the second coming of the apocalypse? Because my little daughter, who's probably, you know, 4 years old at the time, finds out that Santa Claus has left her bells, and I had to do everything possible to get those bells back to Phil. And I'm calling him and saying, Phil, you left your bells here, what are we doing? But we got it back. But, you know, I think one of the things that the reason why people are here and people wanted to go to the church is, I mean, let's be honest. Have any of us collectively met anybody like Phil McNiff? Have any of us ever had the experience for a better person and a better human being? I don't think so. I mean, frankly, he was just the best of us. Thanks.
Greg, did you have anything?
Yeah, I can fill in a little bit. We can talk about, we got the mission to go up to New York, plus we're in the middle district of Florida, and we get the message to go up and do a search at his place, so we have to go up and work with the U.S. Attorney up there. I walked, he assigned me an agent from the bank robbery squad to help out, and the tenor in the whole squad was they did not like George. They thought we were on the take. We were up there to, you know, cover up and make sure everything happened, you know, in George's favor. and we got exactly, that's what we got. But at any rate, I was able to get the search warrant, you have to go through it during it there. We went up to the Bronx to visit his apartment where he was living with his mother and father. I mean, this guy was pathetic, but he was still a mean, nasty person, believe me. But anyway, he's sleeping on the couch, he's tape recording with a little set recorder, and he's got tapes everywhere. And the day we get there, we're banging on the door, you know, to get in, and he's running around, you peek in the peephole, he's running around like naked. Or whatever reason, I don't know. But we never did learn that story, but anyway, we searched and found the evidence, and then that's when we became aware that he was extorting other people. He was extorting a woman in Jersey, New Jersey, and all kinds of bad extortion, which at that point was when we expanded the indictment.
Well,
What you did.
actually what happened was, unbeknownst to us, we indicted the case here in Tampa, and the defense attorney filed a change of venue motion, to which I said, oh, don't worry, those are never granted. Guess what? Granted. Off we go from Tampa to Manhattan. That's what happened.
Yeah. But he was just a bad person. The thing I always thought Phil should have done when he called was, don't talk to him. But like you say, you couldn't not talk to him. So, but it all went well, and we were probably the only 5 or 6 people up there that thought we were going to win.
And I will say this, that everybody knows about George, everybody knows he's extraordinarily successful, very much strong guy. There was one person in America that, at the end of the day, George Steinbrenner listened to, and that was Phil McNiff. And one time that George Steinbrenner did not listen to Phil McNiff, i.e. the payment of his $40,000 because he said don't do it, led to his suspension from baseball. We won this case, and George always told us collectively that we were responsible for getting him back into baseball. Something we never dissuaded him of. We never said, oh, no. We just let that go.
Another quick something. After your dad left Steinbrenner, another agent decided he would try that gig and lasted 1 month. And said, I can't take it. And so show how patient your dad was with Steinbrenner.
That was after his retirement, about third retirement, I think. I think it was.
Well, one of the just a little coda to the Spirit story here, and then I was going to give you an opportunity if you wanted to ask questions, because I know we're up on the noon hour. Phil, yeah, he didn't care about material things. I mean, I remember, I think the last, he got a rental car from George, and it was a Ford or something, and the last one was a Cadillac. And when he got the Cadillac, he showed up for breakfast one morning over here at the Pancake House on Dale Mabry, and he said, Phil, it's a nice car you got. He goes, yeah, you know, I didn't want it, but George said, hey, you got to get a Cadillac, you know, you're coming to the end of your career, and I want to make sure you get one. And Phil said, well, it's got all this stuff in there. He said, Al, do you know anything called something like a blue moon? I said, you mean it's Bluetooth? And he said, yeah, what does that do? And I said, well, Phil, it links into your cell phone. He goes, I don't have one of those cell phones. but he didn't care about some material things, like the car was a big deal to him, and clothes. I mean, Phil was a nice dresser, but you know, he wasn't going to spend a lot of money on clothes. We were up there during the trial one time, we had gone to lunch, and he cuts spaghetti sauce or something else. That was the only guy that he had that he brought up there with him that week. So when we were walking back, you know, tried to clean it, and it was really a mess. And he said, Al, I got to buy another tie. I said, oh, look, there's Brooks Brothers on the corner. We'll go over there. And he said, well, what is that? And I said, well, it's a nice men's store. He said, well, let's go take a look. You know, we went in there, and they had all the ties laid out. Oh, it's a nice one. He looked at the price tag, and it was like $55 or something. Man, it was like it was electric. He dropped it. He said, I don't think we're going to buy a tie in the store, Al. Okay, Phil. So we go out. We walk a couple of blocks, going back to the Vista Hotel, and there's a street vendor selling ties. It's like $2 a piece, or 3 for $5. And Phil goes over there, and he picks up 3 ties for $5. It looked pretty good. It did look pretty good. So anyway, it was almost 11 years later that Phil and I were at a dinner, and I said, Phil, that's the same tie you bought in New York. 3 for $5. He goes, it's the best tie I've ever bought. But anyway, if anybody has any, the last thing I'm just gonna do is just go over the inserts, because I didn't want to take time, I didn't want to pass it ahead of time and distract. But does anybody have any comments or questions for any of the people here? Because we're about 5 or 10 minutes away from saying goodbye.
I just have one, and I don't know if any of you can answer it. About 10 years ago, I asked him, like, why'd you retire early? And he said, this is all I could get out of him, was that he helped stop an assassination attack on Gerald Ford when he was about to come here, and he wanted to go out on top, and I don't, he said Gerald Ford, I don't know. So I don't.
Yeah, you mentioned that to me earlier, and I told you that if he got what would probably happen, I don't know about this, and I don't know anybody that's talked about it, but what would probably happen was he got information, or information was developed, and he part of it for the Secret Service, and then they probably altered the route or whatever they did over there. It's not the kind of thing that would show up in a newspaper or anybody would know about. But does anybody know anything about that?
I remember a little bit, or I'm reading about it, they picked up a guy who had threatened the president of Lakeland. Harry, does that ring bells?
No, but Brooke Roberts might be a good person to talk to. Too bad he wasn't here today.
Does Jim have anything to do with his retiring?
No.
He wanted, because he had one more.
Oh, one more time though?
He had one more year, and he's like, I can't get any bigger than that, so I decided to retire with that 1 year earlier.
My connection to the Spirit thing was very tangential, but at one point in time, there was a significant problem about the 40,000 and how it was paid, and so our law firm represented George. So now there was a problem. George went to Sports Illustrated and was questioned about it. He said, I did it out of the goodness of my heart. And a certain prosecutor was heard to utter when he read the Sports Illustrated, if he says that, I may lock him up for perjury in areas of what he told me. So now all of a sudden about a dozen lawyers from New York descent, they're all upset that this prosecutor, that this case is having a little problem, may throw George in. And they knew he was very capable of doing it. So Phil was doing the balancing act, and they enlisted my services because not because I knew anything about the law. I knew Keogh. We went over, but remember that army of us went over to the U.S. Attorney's office, and they were all scared to death, And so I walk in, and Greg gives me the big bear hug, and everybody thinks things are under control.
It's true. I just know as far as visiting or spend time with my parents on the weekends, for the Spiro calls thing, he used to call the house 7, 8, 9 times a day. The guy was constant,
All the time.
I'm sure I'm on those
So we're on there.
I'm sure we're on those tapes.
Everything was there.
And he would tell me, I knew from the look on my dad's face when I said it's Howie, that it was not someone he enjoyed speaking with. But, so Howie would try to engage me on the phone, and he would say how, my dad's name is so big in New York, you could go in anywhere and mention Phil McNiff, and he would, so it was just strange, but yeah.
It's funny, people, I read these articles from time to time, like, Phil Mushnick and from the Post. They try to picture, posture Spira as this pathetic guy. To a degree he was, but I will tell you, he was a very dangerous guy. And Greg Hendrickson can verify this, because he went in there and did the search warrant, and Spira had specific personal information about all of Steinbrenner George's children, his mother, their name, their address, their social security number, personal detailed information on a yellow sheet of paper about all of those people. And many of them were not Steinbrenner, because they were married. And it was amazing. I don't know to this day where he got that information from, but he had been working this angle for a long time. And to me, that took him in a completely different category as some pathetic guy who was trying to shake somebody down on the phone to the category of somebody bent on something really evil.
He was, and the day that George went on the stand, of course, there were dozens of reporters, and that was a big day. And Greg had him up there and had a Howie's diary or a notebook,
Those
whatever it
papers,
was.
those pieces of paper.
And he was going through it, he was asking George now, whose phone number is this? And whose phone number is this? And George was going, oh, that's my secretary. And then he got down there and it was like his mother. And when he saw that, George just broke down and started crying on the stand. When that testimony was over, that day was over, I knew we were gonna win. I mean, George actually came across as a human up there and everything. The next day, the front page of the Daily News, an artist's rendering of George with big crocodile tears coming out saying boo-hoo or something like that.
Well, you know, I'll tell you the backstory on that. And if you look at Bill Madden's book on George, it's The Boss, and that scenario is in there. This is what happened. Greg Hendrickson put all that stuff into evidence. And getting George ready for his testimony was daunting, to say the least, because of the potential cross-examination. And frankly, I had forgotten prior to that time to take those pieces of paper and do what a good prosecutor is supposed to do and just give them to witness to identify these people. I had forgotten, and we were on a break, and Greg says to me, he says, you better link these up. So I took them and went back into the witness room with George and said, look, I'm gonna show you these things, and you gotta tell me who these people are. I said, yeah, no problem. And 2 minutes later, we're back on stand, and we move into that. And that's when that happened. So this whole idea that he had orchestrated some acting job was just completely unfair to Mr. Steinbrenner, because it just didn't happen that way, at all. And nobody else knows that, because how do you tell that story? It's
Well,
true.
you know, we talk about these cases, and, you know, if I were talking to a group from San Francisco or something, it wouldn't mean anything. These were some of the biggest cases in the last couple of decades in Tampa. Phil was the common denominator in almost all of them. I put together a packet, I didn't pass it out, as I said earlier, but I'll just tell you real quickly what's in there, so we're not scratching our head. The first one, we'll give these out in a minute, was bond is raised on dangerous man and art theft. Wilson convicted, that all has to do with that art theft case. Here's a photograph in there that we put together. This had to do with that Florida Power case. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
And the photograph shows the large number of people that were involved in that case. And again, as Ron pointed out, at that time period, to have those kind of resources to work a case was really unheard of. And it spoke to the clout, again, of Phil, who's sitting right in the middle of that picture. Here's the headline: when we got involved, FBI joined oil probe. When the case went down, 2 ex-Florida Power executives and 5 others indicted on the oil scandal. That was a photograph of the press conference with Chris, your husband, up there at the microphone, and Phil and Marvin Rudnick and East End of the press conference. That's when the verdict came in that they were found guilty. The case was bifurcated. They tried the oil men first, and there was one of them that was sick that we tried later on and we convicted. Photograph of the team that we had over here: Phil, Lon, me, George Wilson, that I talked about in the art cases, in the photograph. Tony Daniels, standing in the middle, Gary Royer. We're all central agents working on the case. Here's one I found that I didn't even know I had. It was a story from, we have the agents have a magazine called The Investigator, and you would send interesting stories in. We had a very elaborate SWAT training exercise going on, and again, as Phil was wont to do, some of the other bosses we had, Bob Butler was good like this too, but some of the others we had, they couldn't care less about SWAT training. All they were going to do was get dirty and tired and everything. But there's Phil down on the bottom, right in the middle of it. I'm talking about it. They got his picture in there. This is the case that I talked about that Brooke Roberts had with the FBI uncovers identity of extortion suspect. This was a guy that disappeared with all the money from the Orange processing plant. This was the headline in the Tampa Tribune when the commissioners were arrested. Anderson, Coppice, Bowman charged with taking bribes. Again, never made that without Phil. There's a photo I found one day that Phil wasn't the SAC, Bob Butler was, who's on the extreme left-hand side of the picture. That's the FBI director at the time, William Webster. He came to town, and he was in Orlando for a speech, and he knew Phil. I saw Webster last year one time. I went to his office in Washington or something, and it was on K Street, and I mentioned Phil. He asked me how Phil was doing at the time, so he knew Phil pretty well as the FBI director and later the CIA director. And Phil got a tennis game together with Bob Butler, and Butler asked me to come, and I was one of the few people that played tennis in the office. We went out, and it was Bob Butler and myself against Phil and Webster, and we were beaten 5-0. And then Butler got me aside, who was still the SAC, and maybe still had aspirations of going ahead in the Bureau. He said, "We got to lighten up on these guys a little bit." And I said, "Okay, you know, I mean, I don't know exactly how to throw a game, but I'll let it get close." And so we lightened up, and it got to be 5-2. Well, when Phil saw that there was a chance of winning this thing, all of a sudden he turned up the volume, and Phil was diving in there. We lost that match 7-5. That's what we were talking about before. It's jail for Howie, front page of the Daily News. They were dumbfounded. How in the world could this happen? Because this was all manufactured. Spira faces Fed raps and extortion tried. Had a little party at my house. I think it was my 25th anniversary at the Bureau. Phil came out there along with Dick Witkowski and Ray Hendrickson's in that picture. Again, you know, people left the Bureau, and some of them went on to good jobs. Phil probably one of the best. And they had a tendency to forget their friends, not Phil. Phil was always there, and on the day, for example, one of many examples, but on the day that they were having a groundbreaking for Steinbrenner Field, Legends Field, Phil invited us. That was the notice for the groundbreaking, and then jumps ahead to the actual opening date, at the first game they played there. And that was a photograph of all of us there, Phil, myself, Buck Showalter, who was manager of the Yankees at the time, Greg Kehoe, who just left, Al McCright, who was the agent in charge at the time, Stick Michael, who was the general manager of the Yankees at the time, and one of George's then sons-in-law, that is now a non-person. And I included this at the end. This was that little thing I read earlier from Marty Bolden. Put that at the end. So that's pretty much all I have. Does anybody have anything before we wrap up here?
I know that nothing leaves my brother. He's always says he worked with men of integrity and women of integrity. We had one of the first female agents come and talk to all of us who was in the office. Was appreciated the support my dad showed. But he felt privileged to work with you all. And we thank you for sharing the new aspect.
If Phil were here, he'd say the Blessed Virgin is crying.
But we as a family wanted to give you a little thank you. It has one of my fathers.
Are you showing me that baby?
At night, though,
Son-in-law maybe, even though
he's available from
I'm
like
sure you
10
never
o'clock.
had heard him say performance not excuses, I'm sure, because he said that to us all the time. But it's just a little memento with that on it, and just to remember, so thank you.
Totally unnecessary.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing.
I thought I was finally gonna get that grandchild.